Did you know that financialization is probably one of the biggest themes of this decade? I'm Anup Maheshwari and I'm the co-founder and chief investment officer at 361 Asset. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the credit opportunity in India and how that's likely to be a key driver of consumption for the growth of the economy. So let's start with the big picture. India's GDP today is about 272 trillion rupees. If we look at the total lending that is given out by all financial institutions in India put together, that amounts to about 142 trillion rupees. If we break that lending further into the borrowers of that credit, we have two forms of borrowers really, corporates and retail individuals like you and me. Corporates make up 65% of that total borrowing and retail makes up 35% or roughly 50 trillion of the total loans in the system. Now if you link that 50 trillion to GDP of 272 trillion, we come up with a retail credit to GDP ratio of a shade under 20%. Now this is an important number because India's retail credit to GDP ratio today is one of the lowest in the world, and that presents a very interesting opportunity. If you look across emerging markets, retail credit as a percentage of GDP is anywhere between 30 to 50%. And as you move towards developed markets, that number rises to between 50 to 100%. So where is India's retail credit to GDP ratio growing from here? Let's look at the other side of the picture. Who are the borrowers of this retail credit? So India has roughly 329 million homes, making up 1.4 billion people, with a per capita income of $2,350. Now per capita in an Indian context doesn't make too much sense, just given the wide disparity of income levels. So what we say is that there are effectively three Indias in India based on their income distribution. There's an India 1, an India 2 and an India 3. India 1 are the top 10% homes in India by income. So that's roughly 33 million homes where each person in the home earns a per capita income of $3,700 and above. Now the interesting point is, of that retail credit number that I gave you of 50 trillion earlier, 70% of that credit goes to just these 10% homes in India 1. So India 1 accounts for 70% of India's retail credit. So credit has really only reached a very small section of India so far. India 1 will continue to grow, but what we're finding really interesting for the future of credit growth in India is what's happening in India 2 and India 3. India 2 are the next 20% homes, roughly 66 million homes, where people earn somewhere between $1,750 to $3,700 per person. Now this is an area where we expect credit to start rising very significantly over this decade. And why is that? That's because India 2 is actually growing the fastest in percentage terms in income relative to India 1 and 3. And what will happen is just mathematically, if India 2 continues to grow at its current pace, by the end of this decade, a large part of India 2 will be similar to India 1 of today. And therefore, you will see more credit going into that segment. In the longer run, the biggest opportunity we see is actually in India 3. India 3 is 70% of India, 231 million homes with a per person income below $1,750 per person. And that actually drags down the overall per capita GDP of the country. Now the big question to ask is, why is 70% of India still at this per capita per GDP? And the reason to our mind is that a large part of India 3 did not have access to credit for the longest period of time, till literally 8 years ago. Till 8 years ago, half of India didn't have a bank account. Now what happens is, if you don't have a bank account, you have to borrow from informal sources. And when you borrow from informal sources, you're borrowing at 40-50% rates of interest, and it is very difficult to come up economically when you're borrowing at those rates. So there are a lot of smart people in India 3 who could increase their income, but they're actually pulled down by these high rates of interest. Now the big transformation has really happened in India 3. Thanks to the Jan Dhan Aadhaar program, India has opened 500 million bank accounts in the last 8 years. This is unprecedented in global history. To a point where today almost all of India 3, for the first time in their history, have become part of the formal financial system. Once you're part of the formal financial system, then it's much easier for organized credit to get to you. So today, only 10% of formal credit goes to 70% of the country, India 3. We are seeing more and more formal credit beginning to now grow. You have microfinance, gold loans, all sorts of small business loans now beginning to flow towards India 3. And that, to our mind, is the first ability of India 3 to really come up economically. And we will see that trend over the course of the next 2 decades. So this is the broad theme of financialization of credit, which to our mind will drive consumption and longer-term sustainable GDP growth for our country. And this is probably one of the most important trends over the course of this decade and perhaps the next as well.